Science is the single most successful endeavor that the human race has ever embarked upon. We have accomplished more in the last 400 years using science than we did in the 100,000 years that the human race existed before that. We use a number of techniques in science, and we've refined it as time has continued, but it's based primarily in logic and reason. And these aren't just words that we throw around, they actually have meaning. Logic is a series of rules that we apply to understand just how it is that we can say we know something, and reason is the process of applying any number of different logical methods and trying to deduce what it is that we can say we know. Two of the most common kinds of reasoning that we have are called induction and deduction. Deduction you've all heard of. Deduction is when we generalize from the large to say something about the small. For example, if I were to say all men are mortal, that's something we know about all human beings. If I was also to say that Socrates was a man, that we also all accept and know, I can therefore reach the deductive conclusion that Socrates was mortal. I have taken knowledge I knew about all human beings and reasoned it down to a single human being. This is called deduction. Now, one of the great things about deduction is if you've made a deductively valid argument, it's unassailable logically. You can go after some of the premises and you can say, well, maybe you're making assumptions here that aren't necessarily correct, but the logic you can't touch. The downside to deduction is that you actually cannot gain any new information with it. It doesn't tell you anything you didn't already know. What it does is it takes generalizations and brings them down to specifics. It's great at reorganizing that which we know. But while it can prove things are true, it doesn't actually add in any way to our understanding of any new information. It can't actually create new information. Enter induction. Induction kind of does the opposite. We take a lot of smaller facts and generalize about something bigger. This gives us new knowledge. The most common inductive example is geese. We have seen billions of geese. Human beings everywhere have seen geese. We know what a goose is. Nobody has ever seen a black goose. Ergo, we have induced that there is no such thing as a black goose. In this way, we are able to generate new knowledge from a whole set of facts that we had beforehand. Now, induction's been around since Aristotle, and since then, we recognize that there is a problem with it, which is you can't prove the knowledge true. It's great at giving us new information from smaller sets of facts, but unlike deduction, we can't prove it. We can only say to within a certain degree of assuredness that we can say we know something is true. There could be a black goose somewhere on some island nobody has ever encountered. It's unlikely, but it's certainly possible. Then along came Hume in 1740 and said, "Oh, you think that's bad? Hold my beer." Not only can we not prove anything with induction, but he found a new problem with it, a problem that was so bad it wasn't even called like a problem with induction. It got its own name, Hume's problem of induction. Hume said, not only can we not actually say we know for certain anything that we use induction with, we can't even rationally justify using induction in the first place. Now, we all use it. We have to use it. You can't get out of bed in the morning without using it. Induction is how we generalize from past experiences to future ones. Every time I step on the floorboards in my bedroom, they hold my weight. I don't fall through them. So I have induced that they will continue to do so in the future. Every human being who has not eaten food has died of starvation. So I make sure I eat food every day. And because eating food in the past has kept me from starving, in the past, I assume it will continue to do so in the future. So when I pour my cornflakes out in the morning, I can say to myself, I'm reasonably confident that this food will sustain me. When I put my key in the ignition of the car, I say, it's going to start. Why? Because it always has. And when I go to work in the morning, I say, there's going to be a tomorrow. The sun will rise tomorrow. How do I know that? Well, it's done that for how many billions of years? 4 billion? That the sun has risen every single day? But that's actually still not proof that it will rise tomorrow. It's strong enough, and we use it every single day. We couldn't function without it. But what Hume pointed out was, if you're going to use any technique for inferring information, you still have to be able to rationally justify it. You have to be able to say, well, there's a good reason for doing it. And while it may sound like there's plenty of good reasons to use induction, I've just given a whole bunch. He said, actually, in a rational sense, in a formal sense, in terms of logic, there isn't a single rational reason to use it. Oh, that's shocking. How can you possibly say that? Well, what defense would you use to say, I'm going to use induction and it's justified rationally? Well, the most common one that comes out is, it works, right? You can't argue with success. I turned on my camera here, hit the record button, it started recording, right? I knew it was going to record. It works. Wait a minute. When I say it works, how do I know it works? Well, I'm going by my past experience. And what I'm doing is I'm inferring from that past experience that it will work in the future. Well, if you've been paying careful attention, you know there's actually a name for that kind of thinking. It's called induction. I'm using induction to try to demonstrate that induction works. You can't do that. That's called circular reasoning. It's also called begging the question. It entails that what I am doing is I'm assuming that induction works in order to prove that it works, right? Because I just said the grounds that I have for it working was it's always worked in the past, so I know it's going to work in the future. That's induction. So I'm attempting to use induction to prove induction works. But the only way I could do that is if I assume induction works in order to make the argument. Begging the question, circular reasoning, begging what's at issue, again, is another one, because the question is, does it work? And I'm hiding in my argument for how it works and that it's reliable. I'm hiding in that the assumption that it works. That's not a rational argument. Now, for people who are used to sort of thinking rational in sort of the common everyday sense of the word, it sounds like it should be a rational argument, but in any formal sense, it's not, because it's committed a major logical fallacy. So that's off the table. We cannot use induction to prove induction. So what can we use? There actually isn't a whole heck of a lot left. There's deduction left. Could we use deduction to somehow do it? Well, if we could, then it wouldn't be induction anymore. It actually would be deduction. The reason induction works is because it's not constrained by some of the limitations of deduction. That's also why it can't prove anything, but it's still very reliable and works well. But it's not constrained by any of this proof business that you'll find in deduction. If we could prove it, it would be deductive. If it was deductive, then its use would actually just be a subset of deduction and would already be using deduction. So we can't use deduction to prove it either. This problem has thus far been insurmountable, and people yearn for the days when the only problem with induction was, well, gee, you can't prove anything. It's just sort of degrees of certainty. So what do we do now? Does this mean that induction is dead? No, we still use it, and it still continues to work. And the reality is every field requires assumptions. Geometry requires assumptions. It requires the assumption of a point. It's actually a priori defined. It's something that you have to assume exists, and then You can create a line, a circle, and you can do geometry. And science makes a number of assumptions. What are some of these assumptions science makes in order to operate? First, that the laws of nature can in fact be discerned. If they couldn't be discerned, there'd be no point. It also assumes that the laws of nature are uniform and constant, and they are not local. They are across the entire universe. So the laws of gravity are not different in a science lab than they are on the moon, than they are on Alpha Centauri. Gravity itself may be different. You're going to be feeling different effects of gravity, but the laws are constant in all of those places. Do we know that the laws don't change? Nope. But so far, they've been consistent, and assuming that they've been consistent has allowed us to do science and be very successful with it. Another assumption that science makes is that the future will resemble the past. This is to say that in the future, the laws will remain what we discovered them to be in the past. Imagine if the laws of nature could change, and in fact did change, every other week. Science would be impossible to do. You couldn't do it because by the time you were done with an experiment trying to understand one of the laws of nature, poof, the law changes. We couldn't operate. So this is an assumption that science has to make. We can't prove it, but we can't do science without it, and science does work, so we go on that. But notice that there, too, is inductive reasoning. So what do we do as people going forward? Because I've had this discussion about Hume's problem of induction, and people all of a sudden feel paralyzed by it. Well, the reality is this created what is called properly basic beliefs, sort of a subset of beliefs where we said in order to function, you are going to have to take a few things based on faith. Now, I come from the atheist community. Faith is a dirty word there, and they don't like it. And many of my friends say, and I've actually lost friendships when talking with people and saying, you actually do have some faith-based beliefs, and it's worth understanding the fact that you do. And that that induction works is one such faith-based belief. You cannot get around it. And I've had atheists who say, well, a rational thought is I'm only rational. I don't have any faith-based beliefs. And, they sort of declare that and move on. And it's like, well, if you were rational, you'd recognize that you have to have some faith-based beliefs because unless you can justify induction, which nobody's been able to do in 300 years, your belief in it is irrational. Nobody's been able to find a rational way to do it. So we have properly basic beliefs. These are beliefs that you kind of have to have. You have to take them on faith. You could choose not to, but again, you couldn't get out of bed in the morning because you wouldn't know you're not going to fall through your floor. You couldn't eat your breakfast. You couldn't put your key in your car. It's faith-based on some level. These are assumptions you have to make. Just the assumption that you didn't snap into reality 2 seconds into watching this video and that your entire life is implanted in a memory, that's an assumption that didn't happen. Now, it doesn't really matter for all intents and purposes. You could still function anyway. But this is the kind of shenanigans that people often dislike philosophers for, but nonetheless are the cornerstone of us growing and understanding how we can actually gain knowledge. And without questions like this, we would never have had science in the first place. Attempts to solve Hume's problem of induction have all failed. And people have sort of found workarounds. People have found sort of ways to, and the simple conclusion is we cannot rationally justify it. We use it anyway. We use it because we don't have a choice. We use it because it has worked in the past, so we're going to inductively assume it's going to continue to work. But it's a faith-based belief. And while it's one that we all necessarily must hold, it is one nonetheless, and it's certainly worth noting. And it's one of those problems, if there's ever going to be a solution to it, I can't even begin to fathom how we would come to one other than just we're going to ignore the problem, which is what we do, or we struggle to improve knowledge and working with it and understand the world around us and grow our knowledge under the constraint that we have to start somewhere. And there's no absolute zero. There's nothing that we can say we know for certain as a starting point. We just start on assumptions. And that is Hume's problem of induction.